This is the recording of the lecture assignment for the epistemology class offered over the summer of 2012 from Holy Apostles College and Seminary. It is co-written by Benjamin Moser and Matthew Menking, and it regards Etienne Gilson and his approach to realism and the relationship between realism and idealism. Etienne Gilson was one of the best-known Thomist philosophers of the 20th century. He was born in Paris on June 13, 1884. He studied under many fine scholars, including Henry Bergson, and although he always maintained a respect for Bergson, his own thought was considerably different. When Gilson began to study medieval philosophy in depth, he saw strong connections with the thought of Descartes, including the use of many terms borrowed from scholastic thought, although modified in meaning. Ultimately, according to Gilson, the Cartesian experiment fails in its attempts to overcome skepticism and lead us to a certain knowledge of the real world. Instead, the method has produced almost nothing but skepticism, and the reactions to it have been the opposite extremes of pure empiricism or idealism. Here we would like to offer a brief overview of Gilson's criticisms of those contemporary realists who would like to do justice to the questions asked by the idealists, and so set out using an idealist method in their attempt to reach realist conclusions. We will then look at what Gilson says is the true answer to becoming a realist, which consists in making a decision for realism at the very beginning of one's philosophy. Gilson's realism differed from a number of other approaches adopted by Thomists of his time. Certain of these thinkers called themselves critical realists. Their approach to the question of realism were varied. Some, for instance, such as Cardinal Mercier, adopted a mediate realism, so-called, inferring the existence of the external world in a manner similar to that of Descartes, while others, such as Monsignor Noel, held to a so-called immediate realism, avoiding such inferences. But to all those who call themselves critical realists, Gilson objected. To begin with, he was opposed to the very use of the term critical to distinguish these philosophies. The term, in fact, had no clear universal definition. It was used at times simply to designate a refutation of skepticism, idealism, or criticism. That is, a refutation which presupposes realism. With this, Gilson has no problems. The term might also be used to distinguish a reflective philosophical realism from naive common-sense realism. While Gilson does not object to making this distinction, he thinks the use of such terminology as critical realism is unnecessary here, for, as he says, at this rate all philosophy would be critical by definition, since all philosophy involves reflection. If it is true that the mode of knowledge proper to common sense is infra-philosophic, he says, naive realism cannot be elevated to the level of philosophy. Therefore, there is no reason to use the expression as if it were necessary to distinguish outside of philosophy between realism that is naive and one that is not. If it is naive, realism is simply not philosophy. If it is philosophy, realism cannot be naive. We need not style ourselves critical realists for the simple fact that we are realists of the reflective sort, which is the manner of philosophy itself. So let us say that we hold a philosophical realism, and since the problem only arises among philosophers, content ourselves with calling it realism, plain and simple. Unquote. That is, if we are already engaged in a philosophic discussion of realism, then we are, by the definition under consideration, engaging in critical thought, and there is no reason to distinguish our position as anything more than realism. To do so would be redundant. Furthermore, it, as Gilson says, presents serious drawbacks, for if a critical, in this case, means something other than simply philosophical, it will indicate a realism which is justified on idealist bases. As Gilson says, quote, if a realist wants to use this term to signify that his realism is conscious of its foundations, justified by reflection rather than the spontaneous judgment of common sense, either critical realism will simply mean philosophical realism, or else, quote-unquote, critical will acquire a meaning distinct from philosophical. In the latter case, experience shows and reason proves that it will become necessary to justify realist conclusions with the help of an idealist method, unquote. It is to this latter approach to realism, one that adopts an idealist method, method of those very systems which it seeks to refute, that Gilson objects, and from which he distinguishes his own realism. The systems to which realism is opposed all work within the paradigm set by Descartes, that one must begin with thought, and from that starting point only, reach things. What do the systems which the neo-scholastic philosophers want to refute have in common, Gilson asks. The idea that philosophical reflection ought necessarily to go from thought to things. The mathematician always proceeds from thought to being or things. Consequently, critical idealism was born the day Descartes decided that the mathematical method must henceforth be the method for metaphysics, as Gilson says, unquote. Descartes himself, of course, tried to reach realist conclusions from his chosen starting point. As this method was adopted by later thinkers, however, the very possibility of metaphysical realism was rejected, as Gilson explains. Quote, that Descartes, although an idealist in method, was in intention a realist, is proved by his meditations on first philosophy. We can also say then, asking himself under what conditions a universal a priori mathematics is possible, he still left the door open for metaphysics as a genuine science. But when Kant carried the Cartesian method onto other ground and asked himself what are the conditions which make Newtonian physics possible, he firmly shut the door on metaphysics as a science, because all physics presupposes sensory intuition, which is plainly not to be found in the metaphysical ideas of the reason. Indeed, all idealism derives from Descartes, or from Kant, or from both together, and whatever other distinguishing features a system may have, it is idealist to the extent that either in itself, or as far as we are concerned, it makes knowing the condition of being. Unquote. This loss of the thing or being, Gilson maintains, is the necessary result of the idealist method. For this reason, he criticizes those attempts at realism which, in accordance with this method, attempt to reach being by beginning with thought. To do so is impossible, he maintains, and those who engage in this endeavor are doomed to failure. Quote, the Cartesian experiment was an admirable metaphysical enterprise bearing the stamp of sheer genius. We owe to it a great deal, even if it is only for having brilliantly proved that every undertaking of this kind is condemned in advance to fail. However, it is the extreme of naivety to begin it all over again in the hope of attaining the opposite results to those which it has always given, because it is of its nature to give them. Unquote. If one begins with thought rather than with the real being of external things, he has already trapped oneself inside thought. Quote, he who begins with Descartes cannot avoid ending up with Berkeley or Berkeley or with Kant. End quote. The illusion, says Gilson, is which people who make attempts of this kind suffer from, even when they struggle hardest against it, is that one can extract an ontology from an epistemology, and by this or that method discover in thought anything apart from thought. A something outside thought cannot be thought of. Therefore, there could be no better formula to describe idealism, and by it idealism stands condemned, because philosophy can no more do without what is not thought, or things, than it can do without thought itself. And if one cannot get outside oneself to arrive at things when one makes thought the starting point, that proves that thought is not the point one should have started from. Unquote.